everyone. Today we're diving into another episode of 5B1C, which is 5 Builders 1 City. This is a multiplayer build featuring several builders all contributing to the same city build in Cities Skylines 2. Our previous build was actually episode 2, so now we're here with episode 13 and we have a lot to do. So hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below with your thoughts on today's build and what else you'd like to see in the future, and let's get to it. So if you're new to the series, you need to catch up on what's going on. There will be a playlist in my description below the video. But if you've been keeping up, you'll probably know that in episode 2, we set up the first part of the North American city. But now looking at the area, it seems a little bit dated and it needs some growth because we have a bunch of low density residential that are right next to a downtown. And I don't really feel like this fits as much as it did at the time. Today's episode is largely going to be about updating some of these areas, doing some cleanup, especially in some terrain conforming spaces, and then also getting in some growth opportunities for our city. One of the major areas we're going to start with is actually redoing the space between the downtown that I set up originally and this newer downtown space next door. The low density residential just doesn't really fit here, and we need to do some cleanup of some of the terrain around some of these roads. So we're going to go ahead and delete all of the area that we set up so we have a pretty clean canvas to work off of. Next up, we're going to go and clean up some of this terrain nearby. Now I have a mod running via PDX mods, which is extended road tools, to help me fix a couple of things a little bit more easily. Instead of redoing the roads, I'm going to use this to upgrade some roads so that we have the retaining wall beneath the road itself. Now we can clean up some of the terrain around this avenue a little bit more easily. And if there's an area where it's still conforming to the ground, I can fix that utilizing this mod. What I don't want is these sort of awkward hills and cliffs is sort of like right next to downtown. I want them blended a little bit better. So we're going to actually level this to the area that I'm going to build, and then I'm going to do some work on the coastline and some work on the side of the skyscrapers that are just above this area to clean up some of that to make it transition a little bit more smoothly into the area that I'm building in. Now I should put a little bit of a disclaimer in. I found out that I was running TAA anti-aliasing, so it's going to make some things look a little bit funky, especially when I have a brush out. It won't be synced up with the mouse quite right. And then you'll also notice some shadows in some of the zoning blocks. So just bear that in mind. It's something that I found out way too late while recording the episode. So if you see the mouse and the brush not aligned, that's why. That's all because TAA anti-aliasing is not working quite right, even though it does present some of the better imagery that I've seen in Cities 2. Now I just want to smooth out some of this terrain on the coastline here to make it so that later I can go in and add maybe some pedestrian paths and make that area a little more useful. For now, let's go ahead and work on the infrastructure for this pocket that I've created between the downtown and some of the areas that I set up before. So when I'm doing this, you'll be able to see some of the distracting shadows again from TAA. It's kind of unfortunate, but they're there. But thankfully, I was able to fix it at the very tail end of recording. Now, ultimately, this would be an area where I would probably lean on more mods, but in an effort to keep it pretty straightforward for everybody to use, I don't have a ton of mods running with the exception of like Move It and Anarchy. And of course, extended road tools. So keeping it pretty simple for this build, but I can tell you this right now, if I were to go back and redo this with all the mods that I wanted, I would probably lean more on plopping buildings using plop the growables and either find it or dev mode to be able to make this a little bit better in a way. And that would really revolve around being able to set up buildings without needing the zoning grid, because obviously zone breaks are pretty prominent, especially when you start incorporating angles and some different shaped areas. And by better, I just mean making it seem more dense, because by the end of this, I started using pedestrian paths to help sort of make parks in between some of the blocks. But ultimately, I would rather it be a little bit more wall to wall and then have parks in a little bit more of a dedicated space. Now, I am going to try to tie this area together using that southern road, but most of this is going to be its own little pocket of buildings, some medium density, and we're actually going to move our school into this area a little bit later. I think by the end of this, though, the sort of blend works better because I'm going to be using some medium density residential and stuff like that, along with mixed use to help blend our downtown into the downtown that's sitting up on this hill. I'm probably going to be saying the word downtown a lot because I don't know how to differentiate everything, but we have a city sprawl happening. So you could look at my space as maybe like the older downtown that just never really got many skyscrapers until now. And then the newer side of downtown that's sort of elevated on this hill. But anyway, I wanted to find some ways of blending these two spaces together, even though that there's a sort of significant change in height between them. So we're going to be bouncing around between a few different projects today. So I hope that I don't make it too disjointed, but we're going to go ahead and set up some pedestrian pathing along our coastline. This is continued from what we set up in episode 2. And again, it just sort of makes the coastline seem a little bit more purposeful. This is just going to make it seem like this area has some attention paid to it, and it's not going to seem so just empty. I've been using more pedestrian paths to fill up spaces, and with some of the mods that are now available on PDX Mods, I've been able to accomplish a lot more than I would have initially guessed, especially when utilizing some sort of texture like different grass options and stuff like that. They start to feel more like actual city parks versus me just throwing down a lot of pedestrian paths. I'd be curious to know how many of you all have started diving into mods on PDX Mods since that released just recently as of recording this video. Because I admit I've been diving into several different mods. I've even helped beta test one that I think is going to be really promising as it continues to grow and develop. And I think there's a lot of mods that are going to open up the game the way we sort of maybe anticipated it being open towards the beginning. Because for those that are familiar with how I build, in Cities 1, I got to the point that I was plopping pretty much everything with the exception of like just normal residential buildings, homes. I still would zone those just for ease, but I would use modded content to make a lot of my suburbs and stuff like that. And now I can do some of that in Cities 2 with regards to like just plopping down your downtown buildings, stuff like that. And that has actually made it pretty enjoyable to like design my downtowns again versus just zoning. Now, since we have some of our pedestrian pathing down for the coastline, we're going to go ahead and start zoning a little bit of the area we just created. So we'll be focusing on medium density residential, some mixed use, throwing a little bit of higher density commercial in, maybe a couple offices, stuff like that. And like I said before, we're going to be moving the school over here as well. And I think overall, if I could go back and, redo a lot of what I did in episode 2, I probably would have factored in the height change a little bit earlier here, maybe even had it sort of incorporated into what I'm working on in this area. But for now, it's fine. And we're just going to do sort of what we can. And I think ultimately, like I said, I think it works and helps transition better from some of the areas that I set up very early in this series to some of the newer, taller building areas that have been created since. Now, something you're going to see me do periodically while some of the buildings are, sort of being created, I'm going to dive in and do a little bit of like work with trees or pedestrian paths, stuff like that, sort of randomly, just to finish up some areas while I see how the area begins to develop. One note is to turn off anarchy if you're using it when you're putting trees down, or else you get trees basically everywhere, which kind of makes sense. But zooming out now and looking at it, and then later when you see it, I think you'll kind of understand what I'm trying to accomplish here. It's not meant to maintain the same downtown as either side is going to be. It's just meant to be a little bit of a transitional area versus just having, low density residential here. And later in the episode, we'll actually be adding some depth to our city. We'll actually be going up on the hill above and doing some suburbs further away from this downtown space. So we sort of accomplished a lot in this episode. And I think a lot of it was sort of cleaning up, redoing, polishing, but then also, again, like adding in some growth opportunities for the city to continue to develop and bring in a decent amount of population. And in fact, it was enough population that it basically created the worst traffic jam ever. It was something that I dealt with when I initially started this place. And now it's coming actually from the other side down the highway, but it's just a massive rush of people moving in because I'm doing so much zoning at once. It tends to happen. Now, I mentioned adding some pedestrian paths in certain areas can give an area a purpose. It starts to make it look like an actual park that was planned to be there versus just open grass area. And I think that's something we're going to do here in this territory between this downtown looking area and what I'm expanding. I want to make this seem like something. It's going to be tough to build in this space just because of the elevation change. So I'm going to smooth this out, make it into a little bit more of a slope versus a cliff. And then I'm going to add in a little bit some pedestrian pathing to make this seem like it's almost just this little park space where you can go and you can walk between these two parts of town. Obviously, in areas like this, you would think that the land value is going to be really significant. So the city is going to want to utilize all of that land because it's valuable. So you want buildings here. So when you have these blank spots, I think it's important to, try to find some way of implementing something in that area, right? To make it seem like, oh, there was a plan here. It's a park or it's whatever it is that exists now. So by using some pedestrian pathing, you start to make it seem like there was a planned effort in that area and it's not just an empty space or a cliff. I try to cut down on like cliffs on inner city areas like this because I just feel like sometimes they just don't look very good. That's why you often see me using something like the retaining walls and tiering aspects of the city, and then using some spaces where you just have a more steady slope. Perhaps that's just like a stylistic thing of mine or whatever, but I think it cleans up some of the areas that you're trying to build if you're able to do little things like that. So essentially, I've decided that the entire lower tier is not going to be made up of any sort of low density residential housing. The smallest sort of housing form we'll probably use in this area would be medium density row housing. I'm going to go ahead and move our school, but this area is going to be cleared out. It's primarily going to be focused on buildings. So it's going to be a lot of medium density, mixed use, and some office space. Housing on the upper tier could probably stay the same. I don't know that we need to upgrade all of that yet. That might be something for later down the road if we wanted to switch it out to row housing or anything else. But this lower tier is going to be made up of primarily medium density and a little bit of high density, spread in between some of those buildings, which we'll do in a little bit, because I'm going to start to sort of develop a skyline in this area, something unique to the space, by selectively picking some squares or blocks and stuff like that to plant some bigger office buildings in, some residential. So besides having the wrong anti-aliasing on, I haven't really had any performance issues, and the city is at 106,000 people, which is pretty crazy. I don't normally build cities this large. Obviously, since we're passing along between different builders, that's going to happen, but it's kind of nice to see that the performance seems relatively steady, whereas if I was building something in Cities 1, I feel like, we'd start to see that performance dip here pretty soon, if not already. But yeah, so far so good in terms of the performance capability of Cities 2 in this build, which is, again, that's good to see. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick areas where we want to upgrade things to high density. I'm going to do this sort of sporadically. The idea here between picking specific buildings or specific lots that I want high density is I don't want every building to be a skyscraper. I don't want to jam this place full of skyscrapers. It seems to lose a little bit of the value of having some skyscrapers if everything is that way. So I'm going to selectively do it, pick out specific lots of different sizes in most cases, and try to see what fills in that space. And much like we did with low density housing, I'm going to start getting rid of some of the low density commercials in areas where I think we could apply a few bigger buildings. Something that still remains true about Cities 2, and it's something that I noticed during the access, is that this game feels like it relies much more heavily on the evolution of areas, especially if you're zoning buildings. Now, if you're plopping buildings, I don't think it's going to rely as heavily, right? Because you're sort of designing the city more so than you are kind of evolving and growing your city in the same way that you would by zoning. But for zoning, it does seem to really rely heavily on this idea of sort of evolving these areas, right? The way land value and all that works. So I think it's important to actually go back and visit some of the things you set up early on and plan to redo them. That's why typically when I'm setting up cities in Cities 2, ever since I started playing this, like, I realized that, okay, everything I'm building is probably going to get upgraded at some point. So it's important to lay down a strong foundation in terms of maybe infrastructure, roads, transportation, stuff like that. But just know that it's likely that you're going to go back and basically redo a lot of that and upgrade it to higher density zoning. And I don't think that's shocking. I just think Cities 2 lends itself more to that sort of evolutionary process. Now, something else that I've started to do more and more of is I'll utilize mixed use zoning for end pieces, for corners. And then I'll actually utilize residential, the medium density, to fill in some of the middle spaces between some of the mixed use to make pretty dense blocks. And I feel like this is an effective layout to filling up areas of downtown. And then later, or somehow in the process, you start to add some of your higher density buildings in those spaces to either replace maybe some of the medium density residential or to fit on some of those corner blocks where you have mixed use. You can create pretty cool looking downtowns. Often I'll go in and I'll leave different kind of like lines and stuff like that in some of the zoning to allow for pedestrian pathing. This could be just to walk across a block or something like that. And then with something like Anarchy, you can obviously go in there and add some trees and some really tight spaces to help make it seem more dense. But ultimately, pedestrian pathing is one way we can detail in Cities 2 without a lot of mods. But I think it's going to get more robust with mods, obviously. And I'll incorporate this in some of these areas where there's just nothing there. Beyond just trees, I'll make it into just small green spaces. I'm also excited for one day being able to have assets in this game, because I think a lot of the zoning relies heavily on an inventory of like brick buildings and stuff, sort of limited windows. And I want to see some more glass buildings pop up on corners, or just some featured buildings that look a little bit newer. I think it's easy right now in Cities 2 to make cities that seem a little bit older, like they've been around for a while, right? You got a lot of brick you can use, a lot of like concrete and stuff like that. But we're missing some of those like really fancy buildings you can just kind of plug into certain blocks that are going to seem to catch more attention. It also makes it a little bit difficult when plopping buildings. And that's something that's been kind of interesting too in some of my early, testing of what that is like in Cities 2 is I'm having to really diversify what buildings I'm using, but also find opportunities to I don't know, use buildings multiple times in a small like distance from each other. Because some buildings, the space that they take up is different, but the building is pretty similar. So we just don't quite have the inventory yet to really, really draw out massive cities where they don't have some repetition in the buildings themselves. So it's become like a kind of puzzle on its own, just to find opportunities to make your cities still feel kind of unique and interesting while sort of designing them versus just zoning them. I tend to have a little bit of a mix of wanting to build like Midwest cities and then also coastal cities, like something inspired by like Florida. And what's interesting is I feel like it's much easier right now to do a Midwest city than it is to do a coastal shoreline type city with a beach and all that stuff based on just the assets that we have available. So now I'm going to start adding in some of our high density office zoning the same way I did some of the high density residential. This is a little bit more of an afterthought, obviously, but I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of buildings to be switched over to the high density office. So we'll get a couple more tall buildings in this area. And then ultimately, I think we'll just let this play out and see how it begins to develop. If we need to add more buildings, obviously you can. And then we can kind of go from there and see what this part of the skyline starts to look like. But I think it's going to look much more dense and packed in here on this lower tier, which is sort of what I'm going for. It'll be interesting to see if we need to add some more tall buildings or if this will sort of suffice, because I'm very sporadically placing them. They're a little bit more planned. And I don't want them to be every building has to be a skyscraper. I just want it to start to create a little bit of a skyline that feels unique to itself. Now, there's another area that I want to redo, and that's this mini little neighborhood that I've parked over here in this little square. To some degree, this just feels isolated. So what I want to do is actually make some adjustments to the terrain. I want to push the height change closer to the highway, sort of use that as an excuse for there to be a slope, while then also shifting the neighborhood itself, or this area, to be a little bit more tied in with the downtown area. And this is pretty much in line with everything we've done in this episode, which is just advancing and evolving areas that we set up very early on. It can be a bit of work, but honestly, because we're playing something where so many of the zone types and stuff like that are released later as you hit certain achievements and milestones, it's helpful to actually go and revisit these areas and sort of update them based on some of the changes in your city, some of the things that become available. Obviously, you get different densities and stuff like that as you progress. So ideally, I want to go in and factor more of that into the city because it's now available. Now, contrary to the system is how the mods have sort of changed this. And I've been spending a lot of time lately, sort of getting back to my Cities 1 roots where I'm plopping down buildings and sort of designing the city more so than working through the evolution of things. But it also has given me a lot of perspective on how to build early on if I do go back and play a more vanilla playthrough where I'm, actually factoring in milestones. Like, it may be worth, folks, like if you're still trying to figure out how to build in Cities 2 or how, like, where your style is and stuff like that, it may be worth actually going and playing modded or playing with everything unlocked and trying to figure out what the end result should be, and then sort of reverse engineering that as you build in a more vanilla style playthrough, where then you kind of have an idea of where things can end up based on things like, specifics, like how big some of the buildings are and how you want to frame up your downtown and stuff like that. And then you can go back as you start to build a new city and sort of factor some of those things in a little bit more carefully. So your infrastructure plans and stuff like that can reflect a little bit more of an understanding of the end result. What I also found really interesting about where we are with Cities Skylines 2 is, we're on the ground floor of modding and how much this game can be like tweaked and adjusted via the mods. And it's kind of neat to see the PDX mod shop out, and we're looking at that and seeing what some of the early mods are going to do to the game with kind of anticipation as to what all the modders are going to be able to control and alter for the gameplay. So it's cool to be in on the ground floor, because when I was playing Cities 1, mods were always there because I came in a little bit later in that lifespan. And I always used them for what I was doing. They were always factored in my gameplay. I rarely played vanilla. And seeing these mods crop up, some of which are very familiar, some of which are very simple, like quality of life things, has been a lot of fun. So I don't know if you guys have checked out PDX mods. Obviously, let me know down below what your thoughts are, what mods you're playing with. I'm sure we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the mods available on the PDX mod shop, and we're going to be diving into more of that, especially as it continues to grow and expand, and just trying to find cool ways of putting some of those into our gameplay and seeing what it's all capable based on what's available. So we've made some adjustments here and we've consolidated this area a little bit, which I think is helpful for what we're trying to do and most of what we're building today and working on today. So now I think we can start to shift our focus into a couple of things. First, I want to make sure that we continue filling up some of the areas that we've added on or redone in the downtown area. So I'm going to be doing that. Plus, we're going to be going in and we're going to be working to add some pedestrian pathing in some areas just to fill up some space. It's going to be a lot of green space tucked in between these buildings in a more sort of vanilla style. I'm not really going to interrupt a lot of just the zoning and stuff like that, or I'm going to at least try not to. Now, for a part of this, we're also going to spend a little bit of time cleaning up an area near the train station that was put in on a different video. We're going to work to clean up some of these cliffs. Now, obviously, we did that with the downtown area. I want to continue it north of there. You can see that area where there's just cliffs everywhere. I want to smooth some of this out and make it seem a little bit more cleaned up. So we're going to try to slope some of this and clean up some of these textures. I'm not going to really redo the highway right now, other than just try to make this look as best I can given the space that I have. Ultimately, what would probably be more ideal is to go in here and just shift the highway over to match some of the lines, but I think I'm just going to try to smooth it out as best I can and alter it as much as possible just to get it looking a little bit better. And then we can also upgrade this side of the highway with retaining walls, and that'll help fix a little bit of it too. So now that the road is not conforming with the terrain, which gives us a little bit of a build on top of the hill itself. And I think we'll clean up that a little bit more. Also, you can see this massive influx of people coming to the city, all because we've done so much zoning in such a short amount of time in one area. Now we have this huge influx. I'm not going to stress about that right now because some of it's going to dissipate as time passes once people start moving in. It's also amazing that just that simple upgrade tool, being able to fix that road as easily as we did, just simple modifications like that are so nice to have. You can then get a little bit more space factored in. So like when you're doing some of the smoothing terrain, right? You don't have to have the terrain conforming to that height of the road like I was mentioning earlier, and it just helps clean up some of these edges because now we can go in here, we can smooth out this terrain, get a hill. We can also move this building somewhere else just to give us a little bit more room and make all this area look a little bit more united. We'll keep polishing this up, but let's go ahead and add some more zones and stuff like that. As we start to see this lower area building up, I want to just keep plugging in more buildings so that we can start to see how it advances. And I'm going to keep close tabs on some of what's zoning as people are moving in and some of the demand is changing a little bit, and just see how we can develop this area. It's also helpful to go and kind of back and forth and check, okay, maybe I need another building here, another building there, as these buildings begin to crop up from the zoning changes that we're making. Some part of me wishes I would have done this newer section a little bit differently to, I think, work more closely with some of the road layout that I had already established. It seems almost to counter some of that road layout, not terribly, but just shifts it a little bit. And I can't decide if I like it. From maybe an aerial perspective, I like it, but when I'm looking from the coastline, it seems a little off. That might be something we change later, but for now, I think we're just going to go with it. So back to the hills for a minute. I'm actually going to work on a pedestrian path that's going to cover this slope from the upper area, and just be almost, like I mentioned earlier, sort of like a national park tucked in here. It's just going to be like a walking path for pedestrians, and it's going to kind of make this area seem very different from what it is. Right now, it just feels like land that's sort of not taken advantage of, right? So we're going to add in this pedestrian pathing and just have it operate with some sort of organic angles and stuff. And it's just going to go over the hill. I'm not going to change how it's going to conform to the hill or anything like that. I'm going to leave it pretty natural. And you're going to get some variations. Some areas are going to be a little bit elevated off the ground, which makes it almost viewing areas to see a different part of town. Some are going to be sort of retaining walled, like you see there. So we get kind of a fun little bit of variety in terms of how this path works. Something very, very simple to run through here, and it's just going to seem like a park. Instantly after doing this, it feels like this was planned to be this way, right? We have this walking area that pedestrians can come on, get some exercise, hang out in. I wish they would do that, actually. I wish they would take a walk through here. Maybe they will to some extent. If I probably connect it to some areas, they would probably utilize it a little bit more. But for now, aesthetically, it looks a little bit better on this hill, and it starts to make all of this feel a little bit more connected. Now I'm just waiting for the ability to include things like stairs or do some brick pathing, some different textures maybe, and then I think we'll be in a really good spot. So for a couple minutes, I'm going to montage some of what I do next, which is a little bit of zoning and prepping in this area that we've been setting up, along with adding some pedestrian paths. So enjoy, and I'll catch you guys in just a minute. right, so I think we're done with the lower portion, the downtown area. And now I want to shift our focus up here to expanding along the upper tier that we had set behind that downtown space. So I'm going to be actually adding in some farms here in this awkward little shape, this pocket between the railroad and some of our industry. And we're going to use some specialized industry in the form of livestock to fill this little pocket up. Now, the good thing about using the livestock is that it doesn't require any sort of resource to be there. And unfortunately, there's not many like resources around where I built. So unless I artificially add that via a mod, we're a little bit limited. So we're going to use some livestock here. That way we can actually supply some more industrial jobs because that is, pretty high in demand. And then we're going to also fill this space up. By doing so, we can add some trees and start to make this area look a little bit like an extension of downtown, fading away from the buildings and into something else. Now, I think I'm also going to end up adding another building around here, maybe like a refinery or something like that in one of the like landmark buildings for industrial that you can add. So that'll take up a bunch of jobs actually, and hopefully keep demand up. I want to make sure I keep it somewhat balanced. I think everyone's been doing a great job of that. And obviously demand is pretty high. But given that we have sort of multiple cities all connected, right, from multiple builders, we do have to find opportunities to sort of balance things, because I don't want anybody to come in here and not have the opportunity to do what they want to do because there's not enough of something to help balance it. But as you can see, the demand meter seems fine. So it's not really like a pressing matter. Now, if there's one little complaint I had about specialized industry, it's that I wish we could control some of these buildings that grow within these zones that we make. Ultimately, like, they just kind of pop up and they grow in the space, they fill the space, but they're often on kind of awkward terrain sometimes in terms of how they actually come up out of the ground. And I wish we could do pathing inside of these zones so that this felt a little bit more connected and not so just at random. Like, it's odd to me that you'll see like a vehicle just driving out one of these fields and not have some sort of path to be on, and the buildings aren't connected to anything. So I think that's a little bit odd, but I guess to some degree you get to do texture and it can kind of fill the space. And some folks do a really good job of setting these up. This is a little bit haphazard, maybe a little bit careless, but we can always go back and tweak it later. So I'm going to add some trees around this later, but you kind of get the idea, right? We're filling in some space here around the railroad that also ties into the industrial area. Now above this, I want to add a suburb, something a little bit distant from downtown, but I want to get some more housing in because obviously that demand is eternal. Like, we're always going to have a demand for low density housing. So I think we can include some suburbs here, projecting again away from downtown. Now the format for these suburbs are going to be pretty simple. I'm going to do a couple of them stacked up here, sort of tiering the ground as well as we work up this slope. Now, my thought is if I get another turn of this build, I might actually continue along this area, maybe add a town away from the city with some shopping and things like that. Something along maybe the main road. So we could have like some farms, some suburbs and things all away from the downtown on this sort of extension away from the city. I think it'd be cool to have some more specialized industry and stuff, maybe some pockets of industrial out here, and keep it all pretty low to the ground. No big skyscrapers or anything like that. And then somewhere in the middle, we just have some commercial. So lots of housing could go out this way. That would fill up a lot of the space that's sort of just lost out here beyond the downtown on this upper tier. And I think that kind of works because obviously the coastline is going to be packed up with buildings and is packed up with buildings and things. So it would just be cool to try to fill in something that you'd see in the background if you were looking from the coastline back. But we could also see what happens with some of the other builders and their turns and see how some of this area begins to fill out, because it may be that someone starts to work in this area and then we'll have to come up with a new idea. Although I think this could be a potential thing that we could build off of. Something that I didn't really plan when we worked initially on episode 2 was like, what would I be working on in, 10 episodes later or whatever. So it's worth some consideration though, that if we can start setting something up for us later, like we would have it so that I know sort of where we can pick up from. I think that's also some of the beauty of 5B1C is that I was actually working on episode 2. Now it's episode 13. So all these episodes have passed. All these other builders have played. Some of them have played twice already. So there's been so much change, so much growth in the city. So it's really interesting to see what people come up with additionally, because you don't always have, something in mind for what folks might end up doing, right? Like it could be completely random what they come up with, but you get a diversity in terms of what the build is. So I think it's always interesting to see how cohesive areas can seem once, multiple people have taken their turn. And that was the interesting thing about the last 5B1C compared to this one is last season, we were all sort of separated, but we all worked on a common city. This one, it feels much more integrated. Like we're all sort of working off of each other in 2 different sections. So it makes for like a little bit of a different look depending on what side of the river you go on, because you have the EU side and the North American side. Obviously, North American just fits typically what I build anyway, so that worked out pretty well. And I can continue just to expand this area. And there's a couple other builders obviously focused on this area And it'll be interesting to see in several episodes how more of this develops and who might take, on some of where I leave off, and if that continues to get expanded from where I end up leaving this off. I do feel like some more industrial pockets could be helpful out here and just help with the expansion to the city. It would also potentially give folks a chance to live near some of these suburbs and also work near them. That could be an option as well. It may be worth at some point adding some sort of train line system or bus system to get out here too, as this area continues to develop. So some things worth thinking about before we get there. Obviously, some others have worked on some of the mass transit options, and this could also be an area for something like an airport, right? And then tying that in with some of the mass transit would be really, really cool. We have plenty of room out here, so it'd be interesting to see if that's something that could fit eventually in a space like this. So we're going to go ahead and add a unique building of the industrial variety into this spot here, which is going to supply a bunch of jobs. And I think this area could fill out and be maybe like a tiered industrial space. I think it'd be great if we had more options for these types of buildings because they do hold a bunch of jobs and they typically look good. So if you can build them up and build some industrial around them, it tends to help out with your demand for jobs and stuff like that. So it's just a matter of needing to be able to use some of them more than once, of course. So I'm going to go and add parking lots here as well, make this into a little bit of a campus. I don't know how much they'll really need the parking, but we may need parking in this area as this area continues to fill up. And this is the last piece to what we're going to be doing today. So some of this is still a little bit unfinished. I need to add some trees, do some landscaping and stuff like that, and polish up a couple areas. But ultimately, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode as we dove a little bit deeper into where some of these areas need to be now versus where they were back in episode 2. So we did some expansion, we did some upgrades and some renovations to our downtown, as well as added some growth opportunities for us up here on this hill. We also were able to blend in some of the towns together a little bit, which I think are going to go a long way, get rid of some cliffs that didn't quite fit some of the areas, and fix a few roads so that they looked more appropriate around some of those hills. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to take a look at the playlist in the description down below to catch up on any of the other builds and keep up with future builds from other builders in this series. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.